welcome to the first seminar of Greenstory. My name is David Goyes. I am researcher at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. Today, three leading philosophers belonging to different schools of thought will offer us tools to rethink how we see life and how we live within nature. They will discuss the place of humans within nature, our moral responsibilities, if any, towards nature, the deep views that can help us live in our ways, and the practical day-to-day behaviors and thoughts that we can implement. We do this because nature, including ourselves, is constantly worse off. The climate is increasingly changing, temperatures are rising, nature and its diversity are in retreat. More than human animals, either domesticated or wild, are suffering, and we, human beings, are also suffering as a result of all this. Our three panelists will offer alternatives and inspiration for other ways of being. Kate Soper is an emerita professor of philosophy at the London Metropolitan University. She is a pioneer within feminist radical philosophy and has a long and influential career within the fields of needs and hedonism, consumption, and environmental philosophy. She has authored many critically acclaimed books, including Post-Growth Living for an Alternative Hedonism. Travis Reeder is an associate research professor and director of education initiatives at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. Travis has published extensively within the fields of bioethics and moral philosophy. Among these publications is the critically acclaimed book Catastrophe Ethics. Martin Lee Mueller is the General Secretary of the Arne Næss Foundation and a researcher at the Department of Foreign Languages at the University of Bergen. He has published extensively on topics of human-animal relationships, deep ecology, and indigenous cosmovisions. Among other books, he has authored the award-winning Being Salmon, Being Human. With them, we will discuss three main topics: the philosophical traditions inspiring their work, the tools they use for thinking about nature and the environmental crisis, and how their philosophical approaches can be translated into everyday action. Before we begin, let me ask the audience, if you have any questions, please send them in the chat. Helena, who is here, who's part of this project and organizing this event, she's going to be gathering the questions, and we're going to transmit the questions to the panelists after our initial conversation. So let me say welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us. This is very exciting to have you here. And let us talk a little bit about the philosophical traditions. And let us start maybe with Kate. I have been reading your work, and I see that you draw inspiration from a variety of traditions, but you always maintain a balance. For instance, in your views of constructivism, post-structuralism, Marxism. So you take different elements, but not everything, and you always are nuanced in your takes. Still, what I see is that feminism and hedonism seem to be the pillars upon which you build your work. So I want to ask you if this is correct, and how you would describe the philosophical tradition inspiring your work.
Yes, thank you, David. And thanks for the invitation to be part of this very interesting seminar. I mean, I guess the background to my own thinking and much of my argument on my most recent work around the concept of alternative hedonism, on which we'll have a chance to talk about more later, that it results from a confluence in my thinking of several concerns and influences. And one of the important ones, and the topic of my first book actually, is the question of human needs. Their definition, how they relate to actual consumption, who can be said to know best about them? In other words, can other people be said to know better than you what you really need? Or are you, the subjective judge on that? And what are the political implications of that kind of position? Secondly, I would say there's been a lifelong commitment on my part to the peace movement, and especially nuclear disarmament, where the writings of the humanist and historian E.P. Thompson have been an important influence. So I kind of come out of a humanist tradition of that kind, and through that kind of positioning, I have tended to defend the humanist position, both in relation to post-structuralism and postmodernism, but also in relation to questions on our interaction with nature, and I'll come on to that in just a moment. And then thirdly, and perhaps most relevantly for us today, there's my interest in the stories we tell about nature, the complex uses of the term, and how best to make sense of the concept and its multiple uses, especially in the current context, where so much attention is obviously now focused on the destruction of the environment and how we might advance to a more eco-benign way of living and consuming. And I'll just comment very briefly on these three influences or strands to my thinking. Firstly, on the question of needs. My writing on needs and human welfare owes a lot to Aristotle and to Marx, and especially to the necessary, if irresoluble, tension in Marx's writing between his view of socialism as providing for the satisfaction of humanity's essential or true needs. This is a sort of theory of alienation aspect of his work. But it's in contrast and in tension with his other account, which is relativist, in the sense that it's always emphasizing historically developed and therefore culturally shaped and constantly changing needs. And Marx, I've argued, and this has stayed with me all the way through in a way to my argument around alternative hedonism, he may not have provided any final resolution. I mean, I'm not sure that one can, actually, and I don't think one should try in some sense. But he has done more probably than most other theorists to reveal the difficulties of trying to resolve that sort of dilemma about needs. And much of my writing on welfare theory and need has related to the political ethical differences between liberal and socialist thinking on needs. And here my argument in very digested form is that liberalism has traditionally viewed the capitalist economy, its social institutions and consumption regime as responding to presupposed needs. And it thus evades questions about the formation and truth of those needs. In other words, it tends to argue that the market reveals what needs we have in the exercise of purchasing power. But that's in contrast to a socialist position, which is distinguished by its openness to those questions of the truth of our needs, as it were, and seeks to reorganize society with a view to a fairer and more authentic provision for well-being. But at the same time, in resisting any market-driven account of what it is how we might best prosper, as it were, socialism has to directly confront questions about the quality of the good life and how to provide more fairly for it. And those issues have become all the more acute in an era of environmental crisis and resource attrition, if only because of the limits and constraints that places. I mean, it's a good question. It's a good problem to have. It's a kind of Aristotelian problem, but it's not always been answered very well, I think. And I argue, in fact, that by treating the consumption regime inherited from capitalism as, in some sense, natural, as essential to us, in other words, treating it as what any future regime of consumption would have to provide, or else by offering reductive and often patronising accounts of what people really need. Socialism has proved politically evasive about the good life and how to provide for it. And it needs instead, I suggest, to align itself today with a more sophisticated and eco-sensitive politics of prosperity, offering a genuine alternative to the consumerist lifestyle. And in doing so, it needs to be more positive about the pleasures of that. And that's my alternative hedonist input here. I've also argued in that context that this more positive approach needs to rethink the concept of development associated with the capitalist consumption regime. In other words, given its unsustainable footprint, the good life of affluent nations can't any longer be allowed to figure as an appropriate model for so-called development, nor as a measure of prosperity. So much for my sort of input from that early work on needs. On the peace disarmament issue, I'll be very brief. As an activist in the peace movement, particularly in the European nuclear disarmament campaign in the 1980s, which was a campaign to promote détente, democracy and disarmament across the blocs in the Cold War years, I will only say that I wish our argument had been more attended to at the moment of collapse of the Soviet regime. Instead, unfortunately, by focusing so exclusively on the extension of the market into Eastern Europe, the Western powers in the aftermath of 1989 squandered the opportunity to rethink the causes and consequences of a divided Europe. In other words, they squandered the chance to create a more peace-oriented and mutually supportive political culture. And I mean, the upshot really is that had Western leaders listened more to the arguments of the peace movement then, at the end of the Cold War, we wouldn't be caught up in the hot one now with all its actual and potential evils. Lastly, as for my understanding of nature, well, there are a lot of influences here at work, notably critical realism, Kant on the aesthetics of nature, Raymond Williams, the cultural critic, and many, many others. I mean, I myself argue for a position that I describe as both realist and humanist. It's realist in arguing for the importance of observing a distinction between the nature which human beings do not and cannot create and the nature which is the consequence of their interventions. I mean, we use nature in both capacities. In other words, we have I observe a distinction between nature conceived as the powers and processes that are the permanent condition of all human activity and environmental change. And those powers and processes are often not directly observable to the so-called naked eye. There's a distinction there between that and what I call in my book on nature the surface concept of nature, through which we refer to precisely the historically changing and culturally conditioned life forms and environment, of which obviously examples are landscape, forestry, wildlife, and so on. So there's these sort of two aspects of nature which are obviously interconnected, but we need to be analytically distinguishing between them, I would argue. My position as humanist, on the other hand, and this is much more controversial today, I think, in being opposed to the position of those who want to ask us to resist making any distinction between nature and culture, humans and non-humans, sometimes even the organic and the inorganic, the biotic, the abiotic, and so on. In other words, who invite us to assimilate human patterns of need and consumption more closely to those of other animals rather than highlighting the differences and the role of that difference between us, both in creating and potentially in resolving ecological crisis. I tend to resist this and argue that it's via by retaining a commitment to human exceptionality that I'm led on to the critique of consumerist conceptions of the good life and the importance of revised ideas of human flourishing. In other words, to the arguments I've developed around the concept of alternative hedonism. So that's me on my. Is that okay?
That's perfect. And of course, you have given us a lot to unpack, and we're lucky that we're going to have some more time to discuss some of these ideas. And I think something else that you have shown is that we are dealing here with questions that seem to be both universal, timeless, but also contextualized and depending on the time that we look at them. And I think if we move forward to Travis, I think you're an excellent example of this, because we're going to discuss also your concept of catastrophe ethics. But if we start with the philosophical traditions inspiring you, I have seen that you are deeply knowledgeable about traditional moral philosophy, such as consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. But like Kate, you also question those frameworks for apparently not fitting current ecological challenges. As I read your work, and you may correct me, you seem to be saying that not everything is total, but not everything is relative. Not everything can be deduced, and not everything can be induced. In some, you seem to say that we should not rely on one big moral theory for all situations. So how would you then describe the philosophical traditions inspiring your work?
Well, I mean, yeah, you did such a good job. I should just have you give my talks. No, thank you for that, David, and thanks for the invitation. I think you've got it exactly right. So, part of the invitation to reflect for today was something like, what traditions inspire you and inspire your work. And it is an interesting place to sit for me because I'm trained in sort of core contemporary analytic Western philosophy. And what I found myself doing the more time I sat with climate ethics in particular, but environmental philosophy more broadly, was really finding myself reacting against these big frameworks that so many of my colleagues were trying to use to understand the ethics of our current moment. And so in particular, there's this puzzle that a lot of folks have been talking about for a couple of decades now. And I think really was brought on the main stage by Walter Sinnott Armstrong in the early 2000s, although certainly people were talking about it before that. And the question was, when a problem is as big, complex, and resistant to individual inputs as climate change, and then we could input and other environmental degradation problems, how can you justify a duty for some individual to respond in a particular way? And so this spawns the problem of what's sometimes called causal inefficacy. And causal inefficacy is this worry that I'm just one person, my contributions are so little. And so if I'm thinking about the climate models and what the scientists are telling us about climate change in particular, I'm thinking about an all-time anthropogenic carbon budget of 3.7 trillion tons of CO2 that would cause something like a 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. And then my individual contribution, when I do something that makes me feel moderately guilty, like take a transatlantic flight or engage in some other luxury that uses greenhouse gases or emits greenhouse gases, my contributions to that problem are infinitesimally small, rounding error on a rounding error. And so this has caused problems for the grand theoretical traditions because the consequentialists say, well, there's only a duty, there's only a moral problem if you can measure, a problematic output. And in climate change, if I take a transatlantic flight to see my family, I get a great hedonic good for myself. and my kid and all of our family, have all this benefit. And the contribution to harm is infinitesimally small, it's immeasurably small. And so it seems like on the consequentialist framework, you would never be able to justify a duty to minimize your carbon footprint, to limit your luxury activities. And so then some deontologists have said, well, that's okay. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm not a consequentialist. So I don't have this problem. And what Walter St. Armstrong did 20 so years ago. So now you've got this problem too. Like, how are you going to justify a duty not to engage in some minor activity that affects the planet in an infinitesimally small way? How are you going to justify that? What, by appeal to the rights of individuals? The effect is way too small to have any effect on rights. What, are you going to appeal to the dignity of people? You're not affronting anyone's dignity if there's no measurable impact. So this has spawned a sort of cottage industry where my view coming into this, a decade and change later, was that modern moral philosophers, especially from the Western tradition, have really trapped themselves because they're trying to use tools that were developed for a very small society in which effects were easily traced to relatively local outcomes. And now they're trying to use it to understand global problems at an unimaginably large and complex scale, where any contribution that my actions do have show up, in the distant future to people around the world. So all of that is to say, when I wanted to think about individual responsibility, I started this project thinking that I was going to do the same thing that all these other philosophers do. And I was going to rescue the idea that you have a duty to be an environmentalist. You have a duty to limit your environmental footprint. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, this is a trap. We have trapped ourselves with tools that are ill-fitting. And what we need to do instead is we need to recognize the really rich plurality of moral reasons that modern life gives us. And those moral reasons end up not just being relevant to climate and broader environmental impacts, but social justice in a really broad way. And we're sort of called on in the face of catastrophe to respond to just innumerably many crises that are causing so much havoc. And we're going to have more time to talk, and I want to limit my initial comments. So I'll just say that the tool that I try to develop in my book is something very practical, where I say our job as an individual agent is to triage our moral efforts. And we have to triage our moral efforts because, yes, as a climate ethicist, I think that the threat of climate change, as an environmentalist, the threat of environmental degradation is among the most, catastrophic things that humankind has faced. And we ought to be worried about it all the time. But we should also be worried about war. We should also be worried about democratic institutions falling apart. We should also be worried about innumerable public health crises and not investing in infectious disease prevention. All of those things are good places to put our moral effort and our moral resources. And so when somebody comes to me and says, how do I avoid paralysis in this current moment? I want to offer them a sort of decision matrix, a framework that says all of the catastrophes that you're identifying are real and worthy of attention. And so the fact that you can't respond to all of them means that I am not going to suggest to you or anyone that there's a uniquely right way to respond. I think how you ought to respond to the threats of the world are going to depend on your privilege and your location, particularities about your situation, about your passions, interests, and gifts. What are you good at? What can you withstand the long fight for? What will avoid burnout? And so I think we can do this sort of deliberative triaging to build a life that is not the uniquely correct one, but is conscientious, that is reasonable and justifiable. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Travis. That is fascinating, and I'm very happy to have this seminar where we can discuss all these concepts. And I think it's a very good segue also to introduce Martin because Travis, you have been talking about individual agents and conscience and so on. And you, Martin, you have been partly inspired by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, the school of deep ecology, but you also draw inspiration from phenomenology and the related notion of wondering. And I think that speaks to both what Kate and Travis have been talking about, because you also deal with the question of the divide between nature and humans, and also an expansion, as I read it, of agency. But I want to start by asking you, what do these pillars of deep ecology and the philosophy of wonder mean, and how you combine them? Or if you have any more that I have not captured in what I'm saying.
Thank you so much, David. How's the sound? Can you hear me now? I thought perhaps first I'd point out there is some background lighting, and we have suggested taking it out of the screen because it can be perceived as a disturbance. How about I invite you to perceive that as a delightful April sun that is setting in Oslo here after 6 months of darkness. So the philosophy, we like to shift perspectives and play with conventions as well. So see, you can be joyful about the lighting that somehow puts the shadow on my face here. Whenever we talk about nature philosophy, there is already that frustratingly difficult word of nature, which for many years I have tried to reject, but as a philosophy, you can't really reject such a potent word. In recent years, I've been coming back to it in its potency, nasci, Latin, to be born, to be birthed, not as a backdrop, but as an ongoing event of emergence, birthing without any center or final form. What appears does not arrive finished, comes forth, passes outward, takes shape, rock, like, and river breath. None of this as a so-called environment, but perhaps as a momentary articulation of a continuous arriving. To encounter nature in that sense, I believe, is to meet this pressure of coming into being felt in our own body as growth, as decay, as renewal, perhaps as yearning or even frustration or despair, even in moments, or tiredness or wonder, as you suggested, David. I also say that nothing really stands outside of nature. There's no thing outside nature. Nature is an all-encompassing, ongoing, perhaps planetary, perhaps biospheric process of emergence. I'm wondering, right? As a potential rather than an answer, right? And of course, perhaps you can already hear one of the disciplines I'm deeply steeped in and trained into is phenomenology, and the tradition of Heidegger before me as a fellow German with all his political woes and problems that he brings, but as the person to, in Western philosophy at least, to bring us back into the world literally, right? Dasein, or being in the world. And then moving on to Merleau-Ponty, who says whenever we are in the world, we're in the world as body in land. And then moving on to our contemporary times, to David Abram, who is my mentor and also friend, who brings the body into place and into landscapes, and who speaks very vividly of the way in which we are in breath, in which we are always drawn towards the center of this big bellied biosphere by this strangely erotic force we call gravity, right? The ways in which our bodies are sense organs which open to the world at all times to receive the world through smell, taste, touch, pressure change, change of temperature, seasonality, and the rhythmicality of place and the specificity of place. And that's one of the important traditions that I'm still working inside of as well, here on the Oslo Fjord. So for me to ground myself in philosophical tradition is also to ground myself in place. Deep ecology is an articulation of a nature philosophy of the Scandinavian countries, of course, which first I would suggest, arises from experience, from experiencing yourself inside something so vast that your mind cannot possibly fathom it. Something humbling to the mind that, in some sense, perhaps I might suggest, puts the mind sort of into its right place. And really insists, this Scandinavian landscape really insists that the world is so much bigger, more diverse, even more sentient than the human ways of being sentient, the human ways of being intelligent, mindful. Wonder is not far ever from this way of working. Ever since Rachel Carson's book, The Sense of Wonder, was published, I believe posthumously in 1965, 3 years after her untimely death, the sense of wonder has really been up front again in contemporary philosophy. And of course, it always has been back since Aristotle's discussion of wonder. But the wonder as, or the counsel of wonder, the active nurturing of wonder as what in phenomenology we sometimes call sidestepping convention, to speak in ways that may unsettle a conversation, that may sound a bit odd or perhaps even weird, perhaps even a little bit uncomfortable in our learned circles, but to do so carefully and succinctly so as to open new possibilities for us to be in conversation, to be in thinking, and also over and over again to ask, how are we in place? Whom are we in place together with? What other beings are also sensing this bioregion through their particular ways of coming alive through different bodies, which are subject to different ways of being animal or even plant or fungus. And I believe that that's probably enough, and I'm looking forward to it becoming a good conversation.
Thank you, Martin. I, of course, have the big challenge of trying to
Yes.
gather what you have said, and you come from different traditions, and these are philosophical questions. And what I see in common in what you're saying, and please feel free to protest if what I'm saying is wrong, I think that you all share a critique of modernity in different ways. I think Kate criticizes the insatiability of modernity and how modernity has co-opted pleasure, for instance. I think I can say that Travis critiques the big universals of moral paradigms and this ambition of modernity. And of course, Martin has a critique about the divide that it created between nature and humans. But of course, this critique or critiques come from different starting points that you have now presented. And the critique also leads to different tools for thinking about nature. So I want to invite you to now focus a little bit more on nature and the environmental crisis. And maybe we can stick to the same order and start with Kate. Because across your work, I see that you have proposed a series of concepts or tools for reading society and nature. I think you have used provocative names that seem to have this internal tension, but a productive tension. I found concepts such as troubled pleasures, alternative hedonism, post-growth. So I want to ask you if these are the main concepts through which you read socio-environmental interactions. If not, you can add those that you want and what you mean by them.
Sure. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, these concepts are very central, and perhaps I can begin by saying something about the one that sort of links them all, namely that of alternative hedonism, which is a bit of a mouthful, meaning really another way of having pleasure. And I use the concept in the broader sense to highlight the potential pleasure and fulfillment of living more sustainably. And for me, that means by accepting that one might, I think personally, we will have to move to a degrowth start critiquing the growth model of prosperity and of economic organisation. And at the same time, it contests my argument around alternative hedonism, is contesting the entrenched belief that sustainable consumption must always involve sacrifice. Alternative hedonism points to the negative consequences of the fast-paced, time-scarce, acquisitive ways of living for consumers themselves. So it has a kind of appeal to self-interest here. The mental and, I'm talking here about the downsides of consumerism, the mental and physical ill health, the car congestion, air pollution, the noise, the excessive waste, the time scarcity, the commercialization of children, and so on and so on. The consumerist lifestyle certainly makes money, but it does so by eliminating time for people to do things for themselves in relatively relaxed and inexpensive ways. And it then profits from the provision of more costly compensatory modes of consumption. Instead of enhanced productivity being used to shorten the working week, we are kept at the grindstone, making more stuff instead of giving us the leisure and facilities to walk or go by bike, to travel more slowly and so on. We're co-opted into buying short, sharp exercises in the gym instead of longer holidays in which we could travel more slowly and experience more genuine relaxation. The tourist and therapy industries profit hugely from their provision for mini breaks and stress relieving services. And I'll say more when we come on to the final topic we're going to talk about, namely its social applications at a later point. Here I want to focus on its implications for our environmental understanding. And as suggested earlier, in defending this kind of alternative hedonist position, I'm resistant to assimilating us humans too readily to other animals, or grounding ecological policy on what we have in common. I mean, I want to put the emphasis on our specific consumption rather than on the misuse of nature as such, And in part, I'm arguing let's focus on human consumption, in part because I think it invites too static and fixed a conception of human needs if we focus on what we share with other animals. We may share indeed basic needs for food, for shelter, and the like with other animals, but we are very unlike them in our urge to do something more than cyclically reproduce ourselves, in our needs for novelty, cultural development, personal self-realization, and so on. This is not, I think, as some environmentalists argue, about giving up supposedly false forms of consumption and reverting to needs that are supposedly truer to our nature. Meeting ecological limits may require us to restrict some sources of gratification, for example, very swift and flexible means of transport, which it seems mistaken simply to dismiss as false or unnatural. It will certainly require us to be imaginative and undogmatic in our attitudes to what we can enjoy, to open ourselves to modes of living and self-fulfillment, rather different from those associated with current consumer culture. And it seems to me that an overly naturalist approach to our position in the ecosystem, which implies that human beings are possessed by nature of a fixed set of real or true needs, of which we could in principle gain an objective knowledge, is not going to be helpful to that form of imaginative rethinking on consumption, pleasure, and the good life. Anyway, suffice it to say that I myself want to defend human exceptionality against theorizations that would place us on a par emotionally or cognitively with other beings. Humans do differ in their linguistic and symbolic capacities and their powers of reflexivity, irony, imagination, empathy, and understanding that follow from those capacities. They're also exceptional in having an extensive extrinsic matrix of science and culture, together with all its institutions, libraries, universities, galleries, research centres, art foundations, all these kind of things. Rather than having to rely almost entirely, as do other animal species, on biological inheritance for the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and savoir-vivre. Animals really have, they rely on biological inheritance for most of their understanding of how to live. But we don't. I mean, there's an important difference here, I think. I mean, I'm not denying that humans are an animal species and share many biological and psychological characteristics with others. Even less am I suggesting we could embrace some sort of arrogant humanism that views the non-human world as a mere set of resources to be exploited for the use and gratification of the human species. In fact, I've been struck and somewhat dismayed by how often so-called post-humanists seem to suppose there are only two possible positions. Either, like them, you're committed to a kind of flat ontology, or you're indifferent to the fate of other animals and planetary well-being. But in reality, and in contrast to either of those views, I see myself as a humanist, precisely in virtue of recognizing both our distinctive role in precipitating environmental breakdown. Other creatures don't share in the guilt of that, and the specific responsibilities we humans, especially the more affluent amongst us, have for checking that destruction. Ecological concern and care is therefore not disowned by this form of humanism, but on the contrary, viewed as a moral obligation precisely because of it. And indeed, for me, the ecological problem is better viewed as stemming from our exceptional relations to the natural world, where in contrast to the cyclical and reproductive mode of being of other animals, we're pursuing a model currently of prosperity that's rooted in an ever-expanding material consumption driven by highly aggressive brand marketing, fast fashion, and the continuous invention of supposedly new needs, whose products are often junked within weeks or never even used. Growth-driven capitalism, consumerism, the shopping mall culture, all this, I think, can be viewed in the broadest sense as generated in response to an appetitive dynamic that's not shared with other beings. Relative to other animals, however, we are, by the same token, also underdetermined in respect of the forms of our gratification, pleasure, and fulfillment. And by that I mean that we're not confined to any specific culture of consumption, but able in principle to break with unsustainable modes of living. And that, in essence, is what you might call the philosophical anthropology that provides the rationale for my alternative hedonist position, for my pressing for a revised politics of prosperity as a condition, certainly, of ecological recovery, but also, equally importantly, as a means of providing greater and more universally available pleasure and well-being, both for ourselves and indeed for other creatures. So, I mean, that's the sort of way in which I see my alternative hedonism coming out of a certain kind of way of thinking about the environment. And I can talk later on about its more I don't know how its applications for.
Yeah, thank you. I think your take on needs and human needs and who gets to decide are the real needs, it somehow captures the complexity of this, and also perhaps the frustrations with identifying what are the real needs and how easy it is to go in the wrong way. And now what I'm trying to do is to weave in the different participants here, because then we're going to have a space for debate and differences. But I think Travis has also been very vocal about this frustration in the human beings, because you have proposed the concept of catastrophe ethics, right? It may sound alarmist as everything that has to do with catastrophe, but you ground it in the logic of participatory ethics, and as well in this, I would say, and you may correct me, connecting to what Kate was saying, it's also a humanist approach in how difficult it is to live and want not to do harm, but to still be confronted with all these needs, if we may call them that way. So I want to ask you, what do you mean by this concept and why it is important? And how does it help us with our moral reasoning when it comes to nature? And anything else you may want to add?
Yeah. So I think a lot about sort of a spectrum of how we can live in the world now that we are so interconnected, and the total outcome of our collective choices do all sorts of things that none of us intended. And so, I don't yes, the title of the book sounds sort of alarmist. And I do think that we're just facing really, truly catastrophic events at every turn. But I also don't think that anyone's intending this, right? I think there are individual players who know it's happening and don't care. And there are those in power who are totally willing to let catastrophic environmental collapse happen if it makes them money while they're still here alive. So I'm not saying that there aren't bad players. My thought more is that the vast majority of people are just trying to live their life. And under the system that we've set up, they're living their life means that they're engaging in all of these processes that collectively spell catastrophe. And so that's the participatory component. So the sort of spectrum that I'm interested in when we think about participation is, my assumption is that morally serious folks, people who think I want to do the right thing and I'm sensitive to the moral reality of the world, when they are faced with being implicated in something terrible, they want to respond. They feel compelled to respond. But now we've put ourselves in a position where once I understand that almost everything that I do is making me a participant in ecological collapse, well, how is it that I'm supposed to respond to that? And so we can think about a spectrum. A lot of folks who are what I would think of as very morally sensitive end up feeling compelled to adopt a purist response. And so they endorse this sort of purity ethic where you've pointed out to me that when I use energy that emits greenhouse gases, and because greenhouse gases are causing climate change, my using energy makes me a participant in the harms of climate change. And because those harms are now here and real and devastating, wildfires that kill people and destroy homes, droughts that, undermine entire cultures and financial systems, mass migration, massive storms. I am a participant in all of that because I'm using energy and therefore emitting greenhouse gases. And so a really natural response is to think, well, those are harms. I've now become a participant in harm. That seems bad. And so I should not. And that's the purest response, the idea that I should withdraw from activities that make me a participant in massive harm, structural threats, injustices. I think it's a really praiseworthy sensibility. The problem is that in the modern world, we've made it such that you really can't be a purist. Because if your thought here is that I should never become a participant in terrible threats, harms, and injustices, you are constantly violating that norm. We're doing it right now by engaging in a webinar. I did it when I drove to campus to work today. When I go overseas to see my family, I do it in a big way. But also when I buy things online and I don't know what the labor practices involved in the fast fashion and sweatshop labor is. The laptop that I'm using right now has cobalt in the battery, and that cobalt was almost certainly mined in terrible human rights violating conditions. So we're constantly implicated in massive harms, threats, and injustices. And so if you thought purity was the only reasonable response, then you get pushed to this really unsustainable and unreasonable mode in which the appropriate way to live is to completely withdraw from society, and you'll still fail. You still won't actually be able to like withdraw from all of these things, but you should try. And so then once people see that, I think they very often go to the opposite end of the spectrum and they throw up their hands and say, my individual action doesn't make a difference anyway. There's no moral reason here. There's no moral responsibility. And so I call that nihilism. And so this spectrum between purity and nihilism, I think presents us with a real puzzle, because they're both, I think nihilism is unacceptable, and it's being faced with a moral reality and not taking any responsibility for being a participant in it. But purity, if that's the only response, that's not realistic, and it's not helpful for, what I said before, sort of triaging our moral efforts. So in my view, a big part of the way we're supposed to be facing the reality of catastrophe and reclaiming our agency is to say, if being a purist, won't make a major meaningful difference because the critics are right, like these are massive threats that result from billions of actors. Also, the wealthy, the powerful, and the politicians have set up the system that limits your choice sets. And B, you can't live up to purity standards anyway, because you're going to work on your laptop and be part of society and this sorts of things. What is a reasonable way to try to navigate this nihilism purity dilemma? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Travis, for posing even more complex questions and how to navigate the messiness of life. And I think Martin also offers, as I see it, an alternative for how to think about this, coming from the humanist approach and then a more everyday life approach. I think your invitation has been to find, the title of your book is Being Salmon, Being Human. So you also use the encounter with more than human beings to try and navigate this. And as I see it, Martin, you're using a key concept, which is that of stories and storytelling. Maybe you also use some others. But what I see, one of the key components of your philosophy is, or the tools that you use to think about nature and the environmental crisis, is how we live in a story of separation. It's what you call the ideology of humans at the center of being. And you show that this is a story and that we can find other stories through humans. So I want to ask you about this tool of stories, and what is the importance of stories for our deep views of life, of our place within nature, and what do we need to understand about how stories work to have them as a tool to rethink or to think about nature and environmental crisis.
Father Thomas Berry, the geologian and Jesuit priest, he spoke a lot about story already back in the 80s. And he once said, the deepest crises experienced by any society are those moments of change when the story we have all lived by becomes inadequate for meeting the survival demands of the present situation. the first time that really became tactile, graspable for me in Norway, in Norwegian society, was many years back. I had just been given a research grant to do a PhD in philosophy at the University of Oslo. And there was an opinion piece in the Norwegian version of Financial Times, Norway. It was penned by a professor of fishery economics. A great big deal in Norway, because Norway is the worldwide leading exporter of farmed salmon, of course. And it's considered the second biggest export industry after oil. So it's a massive deal. And elites have been lobbying for years to frame the Norwegian salmon farming as a fairy tale, in fact. The Norwegian salmon farming fairy tale, to put it in line with the Romantic period and the nation building period of the 20th century, as this great success story, this story from rags to riches, right? So this professor in fishery economics, he wrote, "The time may have come that we Norwegians have to make a really uncomfortable choice, which is to either continue having farmed salmon as an industry in the nation because it creates great value for us as a people, or to have wild salmon in our rivers." He said, we cannot have both. The industry has become so influential on the ecosystems that if we allow it to grow at the rates it's supposed to be growing, which is times 5 in the next human generation, 5-fold, from 1 million to 5 million units per year, the wild salmon are guaranteed to go extinct. And then here came the catch of the opinion piece, and he said, and that is a price we ought to be willing to pay. The death of a species is a price we ought to be willing to pay on behalf of this industry, which makes us Norwegians in a modern sense, in a contemporary sense, which is part of our soul as a nation. That was the argument. I spent the next 5 years researching the narrative context of that. And that became the angle. And this is how story really came into my research early on, because it seemed to me this is not only a question of epistemology or even ontology or moral or ethics. It's an all-embracing kind of question or problem that touches on the whole landscape of imagination, of how we situate ourselves as human animals inside aliveness. And what became necessary then was to also, in the course of that research, learn directly from other cosmovisions, and you have hinted to that in your introduction today, David, other cultures who have had a different understanding of the human in the context of specifically salmon. So part of my research then took me to the Pacific rim of Turtle Island or North America, to Washington State and also Oregon and later California and also British Columbia, to speak with and learn directly from indigenous communities whose way of doing wisdom teaching often gets transported through story specifically. And the case I was looking at was the demolition of the Elwha dams on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula, dams that had been in the river for 100 years to promote peace, power, and civilization. That's a quote from the early 20th century. And now that these dams were coming out, there was also a growing resurgence of indigenous voices rediscovering their voice, right? And story, it turned out, was key to that. Often in the stories I encountered, the human is portrayed as very uniquely gifted with the skill of thinking, of critical thinking, of moral imagination. And the human is also described as one of the most recent beings to have arrived, one of the youngest creatures amongst all the creatures. Other creatures are spoken of as persons, as kin, often as elders, teachers, sisters, brothers, cousins. The language is a language of relationship in which the humans are acknowledged as unique but not different, or unique but not separate. So, just as an example, I spoke with a storyteller once, and I asked him, is there a word for human in your local language? And he said to me, well, there's a phrase. And the phrase is, by the pitifulness of our thinking. And that was interesting, because here we came from two different wisdom traditions, both of whom have labored for centuries on that weirdly, beautifully potent power of critical thinking, of independent thinking. And in some ways, I am in the lineage of Descartes as well, who has identified thinking as a marker of separation, of course, and that's been something we've been discussing for decades. And he came from a wisdom tradition who has also identified that uniqueness and that the beauty of that and the potency of that. But in his tradition, by the pitifulness of our thinking, the phrase indicates that thinking doesn't only give privilege, it also brings responsibility to apprentice ourselves to other ways of being alive, such as killer whales, for example, or cedar trees. I'll mention killer whales specifically because some of my earlier research was with and on killer whales, specifically researching as a philosopher the communicative behavior of killer whales in the Norwegian Arctic. And over again, story has turned out to be a very potent tool, since you asked of tools, right? A very potent tool to work with wicked philosophical problems, such as in this case, the relationship between humans and salmon specifically in their rivers in place. And I'll stop here. There's more to say, because in addition to the philosophical context and the writing, I have also increasingly in the last 10 years taken the thinking into community engaged scholarship. In other words, into how to bring this work into the communities where we live, into practices that engage schools, that engage local artists, local researchers, communities bound to the rivers and drawn to the waters where we live. So much of the thinking increasingly has become bi-regional thinking with watersheds, but that's probably something for the conversation later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I think you all and the tools that you use for thinking about our interactions with nature or within nature, it's a recognition that we need to break with the old, at least what is old in this Western modern framework, be it about how we think about pleasure and needs, or how we think about the moral guidance we follow, or how we narrate our lives. We need, because of the situation in which we are, we need new ways of living and thinking and being. But you all have also acknowledged the uncertainty and messiness of life. And I think that's often something with philosophy. We have abstract notions, and many people also want to know and to get some guidance for their everyday life. So I want to take the conversation there and try to ground a little bit all that we have been saying about what people listening to this conversation can implement in their lives. So I think, Kate, you have also always been vocal about, as Travis has been, you have said that we have too many tools at our disposal. So we should not fall into impotence. There's a lot still to do. So that's, I think it's an invitation for hope. And you also have an intriguing invitation, which to me, which I read as a call to decouple pleasure from modernity and instead seek alternative Hellenism. It seems to me like you're inviting for new forms of sensuality, new forms of pleasure. But what does this mean in daily practice? How would you invite people to go about their lives after listening to this conversation? And in general, what can we do in daily life and more practical application of your perspective?
Yes, I mean, it's a big problem, and it's certainly not being addressed. I guess with the exception of President Trump and the MAGA faithful, the denial of humanly caused global warming has now been recognized as wholly rational. But I think we have to face the fact that despite that, most governments are still refusing to confront the role of growth-driven capitalism in propelling environmental collapse. In a way, that's the elephant in the room that doesn't get addressed. And I think as a consequence of that, I think it's becoming, and also I think we've seen recently some shifting responses on green policies, and actually, a weakening of the commitment to net zero. And this, I think, it's difficult not to construe this as the manifestation of an abiding neo-colonial attitude, one whose underlying argument can't exactly be spoken, but consists in a readiness to settle for the catastrophic impacts in the future on the poorest and least responsible, the poorest and most vulnerable but least responsible communities elsewhere in the world, given that affluent nations look likely to remain relatively unscathed and certainly more resilient, having the funds to be more resilient to the floods and fires that do come our way. So it's a very critical moment for green campaigning, and one in which I think it becomes very important to expose the evasions of mainstream economic argument and to pressurize governments to adopt more radical alternative measures. But in doing that, I think it's also important to be not just reactive, but creative, to insist on the viability of an alternative political economy, and to try to show how it might work and to defend our distinctive human capacities to transform our politics. And the argument for alternative hedonism has been involved in that spirit, and it only really makes sense in the light of a belief in our uniquely human powers to remake our world. Hence, you're right, I think, about linking my position to some argument in favour of having some hope still. So just a word on how this might look in application. The countering vision to resource-intensive consumption is centred on a reduction of the working week, the resulting release of free time, and the pleasures of a generally slower pace of living. Here in the UK, the New Economics Foundation has for some time been advocating a shift to a 21-hour week and arguing its benefits in terms of lowering the carbon footprint, reducing unemployment, improving well-being, and promoting better childcare, more co-parenting, and more equality between the sexes. We should also, I think, promote the potential of a less intensive work culture for introducing more fulfilling forms of work, developing new skills, and reinstating some earlier ways of doing and making. Here I think I have some overlap with what Martin's saying. We should be looking to other cultures and not just to the so-called most developed, which I regard now as overdeveloped in a way, and to be prepared to learn more about sustainable living from cultures that we have tended to see as marginal and in need of development. Well, no, I think we have to start reversing that way of thinking. Also, in a slower paced society, artisan production could expand and allow more people to benefit from the particular skills and forms of concentration in work and self-fulfillment that can provide. And we could in a less work-driven existence, we could allow for advanced green technologies in fields like medicine and transport and agriculture, and energy provision to coexist alongside slower, more artisan-based ways of working. We could have a sort of win-win sort of situation there where we have the best of smart technology in some areas, plus rethinking our work model and flow of mobility and so on. And at the same time, ecologically benign forms of production could help to exclude built-in obsolescence and radically reduce waste also. The other thing I mentioned here is simply that a work culture less dominated by profit-driven ideas of efficiency could also free up time for more self-provisioning. So where market provision based on mass production of standardized articles tends to homogenize the ways in which we meet our needs and wants, we could have instead networks of sharing, recycling, exchange of goods and services, and allow ourselves forms of provision that would both reduce carbon emissions while at the same time creating more eco-sensitive ways of living and allowing us to, engage in more of our own forms of eccentricity. So there are a lot of advantages here, I think, to moving to a slower paced and less productivity driven, less work ethic driven kind of culture. I think I think it's true though that at the moment, that we don't have enough support here for this kind of transition. In seeking to win support for alternative hedonist living, I've argued that its new forms of desire and the potential media and cultural influence upon them, rather than fears of ecological catastrophe, that are likely to have most impact in any shift towards more sustainable modes of consuming. And in that context, I've pointed to the emergence of forms of disaffection with a work-dominated existence. People are actually, we have failing public services, they have bullshit jobs and permanent job insecurity. There are lots of disadvantages with the current system, and by focusing on those negative reactions, inarticulate as many of them may be, I'm trying to avoid a kind of moralizing about true needs that's often characterized earlier left critiques of consumer culture. What I'm trying to do is to engage instead with signs of consumer disenchantment and ambivalence as these evolve and find expression in the sensibility or behavior of consumers themselves. In other words, I'm trying to kind of point here to an emergent, imminent critique of the consumerist way of living among people themselves, particularly important in affluent cultures. But as I say, it's also true that those consumers are probably still in the minority, and we need in that sense to recognize the dialectical dependencies of government and people, both in the creation of environmental breakdown and the mutual responsibilities we therefore have in doing something about it. One last word simply here about growth. I think in a transition to a less growth-obsessed economy, we will have to allow that in the short term there will be some expanding activities in areas such as renewable energy, housing, education and caring services. And growth will also be needed to provide for those global communities currently deprived even of basic need provision. Because let's not overlook here the fact that the percentage of people who are causing most of the environmental damage is relatively, I mean, there's a massive disproportion between the kinds of ways of living that are causing the environmental breakdown and the populations who are amongst the more poorest and deprived. And they will need to actually be allowed to. I mean, I don't think we'll make progress in overcoming environmental breakdown without it going in tandem with the correction for massive global inequality, both globally and nationally, actually. But critics of degrowth shouldn't be allowed to seize on those kinds of concessions as proving their case against its overall coherence, because that form of growth is highly distinctive. It consists in essential productive expansion within an economic system that is being redesigned in order to foster ways of living very different from those of a profit-driven capitalist consumer culture. So the critique is of the idea that you can't have any effective economy without growth, rather than that we can allow that we will need in a transition to have some kind of growth. And lastly, I think I just in line with this, I've argued that we need to challenge the hegemonic sense of progress or development as definable in terms of a historically linear process of amelioration. I mean, nations whose consumption grossly exceeds the planet's carrying capacity can't any longer be thought of as models of well-being for the so-called developing world. And basically, I also think that, obviously there's going to be massive opposition to any moves of this kind. And I'm under no illusions about the obstacles standing in the way of any shift in popular thinking. But my hope is that by supplying a broader cultural dimension to the existing arguments and outlook of the political wing of anti-systemic forces, alternative hedonism can help in aspiring a more diverse and substantial opposition to prevailing economic orthodoxy. I don't think it's going to be easy to persuade voters to support the needed changes, although there are now growing numbers who are feeling themselves disenfranchised, I think, by the want of political representation of their support for any alternative to the growth agenda. But I still think the fear has to be that for lack of an imaginative and compelling defence of its potential to deliver a fairer and more pleasurable way of living for society as a whole, more ground will get ceded to the defiant inaction on climate change of the extreme right, who will then be sure to mobilise resentment against all of us, migrants, Greens, cyclists, the scientific elite and so on, who can be made scapegoats for the distressing social and environmental consequences that will follow.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. When you were talking about or against efficiency, you got me to think when I was conducting fieldwork with Colombian indigenous communities, that the Bari who live in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, they said, we are not productive, and many people from the West judge us for that. But we think that's good, because the less productive we are, the less we take from nature. So that's on the one of the perspectives. And then also, when you talk about disenchantment, I think that can also come from the other extreme, from those who are consumers and see that there's no real meaning in their consumption, that it's not adding to their lives. And I want to move on a little bit toward Travis, because I think maybe you are addressing those who are in the middle, those who are not yet disenchanted, those who do not have, in a way, the possibility to live in a different way, but they are trying to live the best way they can. And I found very compelling your argument, in the sense that you're rejecting, on the one hand, the ethic of purity, which is also very tempting for us who are concerned about nature, because I don't want to be complicit with all this, but also nihilism, which is I don't care about anything. And you are also very hands-on in inviting people to take part in social life, but you also provide some heuristics and peremptory reasons to make decisions. So what are these everyday practices and tools that you give to people to live Bailey?
Yeah, I think the most simplest way to put it is that I want people to think about how to be a participant within systems, because the whole discussion that we're having is about collective actions, and that's what raises the puzzle about what you can do as an individual. But it's not as if collective action and individual action are completely unrelated. Collectives are made up of individuals, and that's why we feel moral pressure of, as you say, complicity. So what I want people to do is to think about, how can I be a participant? What are the different ways that I can be a participant? And one of the benefits that I think of using that language of participating in is that we don't only participate in harms, threats, and injustices. We also participate in solutions. And so this invites distinguishing between negative and positive reasons, what I call negative and positive reasons, that often when you say, what should I do in the face of climate change, if I'm being angsty about it, the obvious thing that's put forward is negative reasons. You have reason not to emit. You have reason not to be part of the problem. But of course, climate change gives us all sorts of positive reasons as well. Reason to be part of structural collective change, to gather with like-minded people, to try to change, what's happening locally, also to, be part of writing campaigns and public speaking and all of these things to get. Again, to be clear, I'm not deluded in thinking that you are going to make the difference, that stops a hurricane. That's not the goal here. The goal is to be a participant, and now we can flip the valence. So it's not only about not being a participant in bad things, not being a part of the problem, but now you also get to be part of the solution. And so you mentioned my use of heuristics. When I think about heuristics, the goal is, rules and heuristics have a sort of set it and forget it value that, sure, I could approach every day as if it were the first day on planet Earth. And, am I going to eat animal products today? Am I going to drive my car today? Like all of these things that make me part of the problem. Or I could say, that's all really overwhelming. It's all taking a huge cognitive load. So let's do some deliberation in advance. So we go back to the questions that I'm really interested in, like, what am I good at? What do I have bandwidth for? What's my privilege? What is the space in which I can, really see myself as an agent? And then the whole real estate of opportunities is not just negative reasons, it's negative and positive reasons. So if I want to focus on climate change, and I do, sure, I have reasons not to be part of the problem. And so those are genuine reasons not to engage in lots of luxury behaviors, even though the average luxury behavior doesn't have a huge, meaningful causal impact on a problem this big. I still have real reasons. But let's not be obsessed with those reasons when you can also have reasons to be part of solutions, to try to make change as part of the collective. So there are some authors that I was really influenced by because I feel like it's sort of in vogue right now to really talk down on the negative reasons. And so David Wallace Wells, who wrote on Uninhabitable Earth, and Marianne Hagler, who's a fantastic climate justice activist and writer, they've both written independently about, stop worrying so much about keeping your hands clean. You can't, you won't, it doesn't make a difference. I want you in the fight. I want you to be part of the political situation. And some of my more activist friends are like, why not both? Keep your hands clean and march in the streets. But what I found really valuable about Hagler and people like Wallace Wells and even the climate scientist Michael Mann is a reminder that threats call on us to respond in multiple ways. And so we can always ask ourselves the question, how am I participating in problems? How am I participating in solutions? And then constantly sort of tweaking our response to live the most justifiable life we can.
Thank you, Travis. That's brilliant. And I think that sets up the table very nicely for Martin as well, because Kate has talked about creativity, Travis has talked about participation, and I think you have also in your writing come with very exciting invitations for both being creative and for participating. You have invited us to find alternative stories in More Than Human Animals. And something that intrigues me is your invitation to reawaken our animal life part that we have denied ourselves. So how do we do this in daily life? And what does this reawakening of our animal life parts entail?
Thank you so much. I'm very excited about the turn of the conversation toward the new forms of sensuality and pleasure that you have spoken about, Kate, but also the conversation on how are we participants both in injustices and solutions that you invoke, Travis, which makes me even more excited to get even deeper into the writings and teachings of both of you. We humans too come with gifts is something salmon have taught me. Salmons are participants in ecological systems deluxe par excellence as keystone species who actively through their life cycle feed hundreds, if not thousands of other species. It's a life cycle that's been described beautifully by poets and scientists and storytellers alike. And it's a story that keeps coming back to the ontic quality of the world as gift. That to be in a body is already to be gifted. And the salmon bring the gift of their flesh, and ecology speaks of it as the keystone species, right? And from that also comes this intriguing possibility, and this is where I'd like to connect directly to what you spoke, Travis, the intriguing possibility that we too are endowed with gifts that make us beautiful and perhaps something more than nuisances to land, to environment, to ecologies where we may live, that may allow us to leave traces of a world that becomes richer and more diverse. I'm thinking of something as simple as a story well placed or a word of appreciation spoken. Now that spring is coming, and the chiffchaffs are just returning from their southward journey. They only did yesterday, and all the geese are returning, and the cranes have yet to come. People all around are waking up and speaking in quiet wonder. Have you seen? Have you heard? And echoing the return and the emergencies in land through voice, through words of appreciation, through newfound allowance of sensuality in the body. All these are genuine gifts, I would argue. Gifts in the body and the shape and the form, the quality of the human. So we too can be storytelling animals. We can speak, sing. It starts there. Or we can simply say he or she or they to another being rather than it, and actively reject the objectification of another being through language as a way of paying respect. That too is something very practical and very simple all of us can do. Or we could try to encourage our children who still actively encounter another being, whether it is a tree or rock, as a subject, as a person, to not actively socialize that out of our children as teachers or caretakers. It's something very simple we can try, right? Locally and regionally, we work a lot with rituals, seasonal rites, celebrations, as cultural bodies, as cultural tools and technologies to continuously negotiate what it is to be a storytelling animal in place, as a way to concretely and practically, through everyday questions, keep asking, how can we participate meaningfully here through the gift of voice that we have been given and the gift of thinking? So these are some of the things. One of the even more concrete works that is ongoing in the Oslo fjord, a fjord that is in an ongoing state of collapse, is a work towards granting legal rights of personhood to this fjord, as also something very, very concrete that has spread around the world and has yet to take a hold in Scandinavia. This may become the first fjord in the world to be granted rights of legal personhood, done by a coalition of thinkers, intellectuals, artists, and also faith keepers in our fjord. And then there's a flip side to the joy. And I just like to mention that briefly because this too is something I believe we can do, which is simply to allow the grief of living in this time and the overwhelm of living this time. Because what if grieving too can be a way of participating in the ongoing emergence of aliveness, as a way of acknowledging you have existed, your existence mattered, and in an existential way, just because you existed, I simply bear witness to your passing, perhaps even as a love language. Perhaps the depth of our grief, in some sense, measures or echoes our ability to care deeply. So I would just throw that in, that even to allow the darker experiences of living in this time may be a way of participating a little bit more humbly in this ongoing emergence that is nature or aliveness, this wild beast of a big-bellied planet that is on her own storied journey through deep time.
That was beautiful, Martin. So you have all provided us with many ways, new ways of thinking, from the deep philosophical pillars for more specific tools for thinking about nature and ourselves, from to daily practices that we can implement. I want to round up the conversation by, and you started doing that, Martin, but I want to invite you to reflect also on if there are limits to your thoughts, and also how you can incorporate what the other panelists have presented. What's that limit or the shortcomings of your philosophy, and how do you think it can relate to what your co-panelists have presented, and how you can feed those ideas into your own thinking? I'm not going to mention who, but feel free to intervene.
Well, I can say just one very quick thing. I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that I work within contemporary analytic philosophy in the Western tradition. And so part of what I was doing was responding to my unsatisfaction with how those tools address the world that we find ourselves in. But I'm still working within that tradition. And so very often when I give talks on this material or have conversations with others from different disciplines and different backgrounds, one of the things they note is that I'm raising a problem that only some people really wrestle with, because there are different tools, different cultural norms, ways to deal with our sort of this puzzle of being an individual amidst big collectives. And so I just take that readily on board and say, this is really, I am wrestling with a puzzle that some population has, that some population wrestles with. And it doesn't mean that it's like in the natural order of things is like carving nature at the joints. rather, I sort of invite any tools that help us make better sense of it.
Thank you. And this is also part of what we're trying to do, because we're going to have similar webinars with representatives of different religions from Catholicism, Islam, and beyond, with scientists from different disciplines, from biology to psychology and so on, and with indigenous intellectuals from around the world. So that's part of the puzzle we are also trying to solve.
I mean, one thing that I would just like to mention in a way, I think, in this context is the vastly different contributions globally of different communities to this environmental crisis. And therefore, I think we should also be emphasizing the differential responsibilities that we have. I mean, the most vulnerable and poorest communities of the world are hardly emitting any carbon at all, actually, in their daily lives, whereas the vast bulk of it is produced by about 15% of the global population, with America obviously being one of the most major contributors at the individual level. So I think I would just like to throw that in as a context that we do also need to recognise. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't alter the sort of argument that Travis is making about the question of individual responsibility, but I do think that it's a mistake to see this, to universalise what is going on in the moral dilemmas of the most affluent communities, because it doesn't actually apply more globally. That's one thought I had. I mean, I think on the limits of my own argument, I think that many people have responded by saying that I am putting the onus too much on individual changes of consumption. I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding of my intention. Where I'm coming from, I suppose, is I think it's very easy. People like David Wallace Wells do it, they can alarm us by very profoundly through the arguments about the consequences of climate change and of shooting beyond, the agreements of the Paris meeting and so on. But we then, I don't think panicking about our condition is the best way of going forward here. So, I think we do have to look for ways of thinking about it as an opportunity for moving more collectively, actually, but with the onus primarily on the more affluent nations to an alternative way of working and of consuming. So it's not so much that I'm saying to individuals, change your ways. I agree that is problematic within the existing cultural way in which we're, set up. What I am suggesting is that if we're going to have transformation here, then we need to have a cultural revolution around our ideas of the good life and of prosperity. And through that, put pressure on governments. We need to, as it were, create more of an electoral mandate, and we need to do it across different nations, and we need to do it within groups of, that are already part of the Western affluent community primarily. Okay.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, the north-south or west and the rest division is, of course, crucial for these debates. Martin, you have the last word here.
Perhaps it can be the second to last word. I can think of one else who deserves to be listened to after this. I have two very different thoughts that come to mind when I listen to you, Travis, and to you, Kate, and to you, David. One is philosophers are perhaps more needed than ever. And yes, we may be speaking in different dialects, all of us here, because we come from different traditions and the larger community of academic philosophy, say Western philosophy even, and even more so in nature philosophy, or if you will, in eco-philosophy, there are, of course, tendencies to critique the thinking part of the human, and that also can go far too far, because critical thinking is so crucial in these times when it's become more and more suspicious. So beyond our different dialectics, I do think we all share, and I didn't need it, but I do have a newfound appreciation from this conversation for the insistence on the beauty of thinking itself in its own right, and the intrinsic value of that. So for that, thank you, Travis and Kate, and to you organizers for just facilitating that. That in itself, I think, deserves to be spoken. And then there's a second one. Back in 1949, when Aldo Leopold published his Sand County Almanac. I believe it must have been in 1949. He had this famous phrase, thinking like a mountain, right? Which in some sense sparked academic eco-philosophy, at least in the Anglo-Saxon canon. I've more and more come to wonder if there is not actually a possibility that we're also thinking not just like mountains, but also, and I'm trying to be quite concrete and literal, perhaps even, to think with river and salmon and spruce trees, or humpback whales, or guillemot who are coming into our fjords, tell us of starvation events happening in the Atlantic, to actually explore the possibility that we can still think with the entire vast, perplexing multiplicity of the more than human world. And I've just written a book about this, which is due next week. But so I'm sort of steeped in this now. I'm finding this hopeful that there is so much thinking yet to be done, if only we still allow ourselves to soften to the voice of Chifchav, or the creaking of spruce trees in an autumn storm, and all these very real other subjectivities in the lands, their own storylines. And what if we take those seriously as co-interlocutors with whom we can actually be in exchange? Of course, there's a lot to be unpacked. It's to be done carefully and slowly and humbly, but I do think there are so many thoughts yet to be thought that can enrich these conversations, and I would think humanize the conversations amongst us as well. And I would wonder if perhaps the last word maybe wants to go to, and of course, this is from me, a more than human other that each of us perhaps has a dear relationship with. If perhaps the listeners can try to summon in their own imagination a more than human other they're particularly fond of. Perhaps it is the voice of a songbird, now that it's spring, and just allow that voice to just come into the conversation without speaking it, but just to allow that to emerge inside of themselves. I do think they do deserve to be given voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, of course, to Helena Kamfjord, who organized this webinar. And thank you for those who joined. I'm going to invite you, panelists, to stay for 2 more minutes. We're going to end up the transmission now, but thank you to all who attended.